Picture a system that has been running without interruption for decades. No pauses, no maintenance windows, no downtime. Every input is immediately processed, every signal demands a response, and every cycle pushes forward without reflection. Over time, wear accumulates. Efficiency declines. Small errors compound into structural failure. This is not a metaphor for industry. It is a precise description of how the modern human body is being used, and more importantly, misused. Most people approach intermittent fasting with one goal in mind: weight loss. They want the scale to move, the waistline to shrink, the mirror to change. That expectation is understandable, but it is also shallow. Because weight loss is not the primary effect of fasting, it is a side effect. The real impact of intermittent fasting operates at a deeper biological level, one that has far more to do with aging, cellular repair, and metabolic resilience than calories or willpower. Every time you eat, you send a biochemical instruction to your cells. That instruction is not subtle. It tells your body to grow, to build, to store, to expand. In isolation, this is not harmful. Growth is essential. But in the modern environment, this signal never turns off. Breakfast blends into snacks. Snacks blend into lunch. Lunch into more snacks. Dinner into late-night calories. From the perspective of your cells, there is no pause, no silence, no opportunity to shift priorities. The body remains locked in a constant state of nutrient processing. Biologically, this is a problem, because cells are not designed to grow continuously. They are designed to alternate between phases of growth and phases of repair. When food is constantly available, growth dominates. Repair is postponed. And postponed repair is not neutral, it is cumulative damage. Proteins misfold and accumulate. Mitochondria lose efficiency. Cellular waste builds up. Inflammation becomes chronic. This is not aging in the traditional sense. It is accelerated biological wear driven by uninterrupted signaling. One of the most persistent myths about aging is that it is purely chronological, that the body declines simply because time passes. In reality, aging is strongly influenced by how often the body is allowed to enter repair states. The mechanisms that slow aging do not activate during constant feeding. They activate during periods of scarcity. Not starvation, but absence. Absence of incoming energy, absence of insulin signaling, absence of digestive demand. These conditions are not extreme. They are ancestral, and they are deeply encoded in human physiology. When someone begins intermittent fasting, the initial experience is rarely pleasant. Hunger intensifies, energy dips, mood becomes unstable, headaches appear. This discomfort is often interpreted as danger, as a signal that something is wrong. But biologically, this interpretation is backward. What is being experienced is not damage. It is transition. The body is shifting from a single fuel dependency to a multi-fuel system it has not used efficiently in years. Most modern humans are metabolically inflexible. They rely almost entirely on glucose for energy. When glucose availability drops, they experience stress because the body has forgotten how to access its secondary fuel reserves efficiently. Fat stores represent tens of thousands of calories of energy, yet without proper hormonal conditions, that energy remains inaccessible. Insulin is the gatekeeper. As long as insulin remains elevated, fat remains locked away. During the first 12 to 18 hours of fasting, liver glycogen is depleted. This is a critical turning point. As glycogen drops, insulin levels fall. And when insulin falls, the metabolic environment changes. Fat becomes available, not just as stored energy, but as a source of ketone bodies that can fuel the brain. This transition is not instantaneous, but once underway, many of the initial symptoms resolve. Hunger quiets. Mental clarity improves. Energy stabilizes. What felt like deprivation begins to feel like control. At this stage, fasting is no longer about endurance. It becomes about biology, doing what it was designed to do. With digestion paused and insulin suppressed, cellular priorities shift. Energy is no longer being shuttled inward for storage. Instead, the cell begins to assess its internal environment. This is where one of the most important longevity mechanisms becomes active: autophagy. Autophagy is not a trend, it is a foundational cellular process. It is the system by which cells identify damaged components and recycle them. Old proteins are broken down, dysfunctional mitochondria are dismantled, cellular debris is cleared. This process does not occur efficiently when food is constantly present. It requires metabolic quiet. It requires absence. It requires time without incoming nutrients. Intermittent fasting provides that window. This is why the effects of fasting extend far beyond body composition. Cleaner cells function more efficiently. Mitochondria produce energy with less oxidative stress. Inflammation decreases. Insulin sensitivity improves. These changes directly influence aging trajectories. They do not make time stop, but they slow the rate at which biological damage accumulates. One of the greatest fears surrounding fasting is muscle loss. This fear is intuitive but misplaced. From an evolutionary perspective, breaking down muscle during periods without food would be catastrophic. Muscle is functional tissue. It enables movement, hunting, survival. During short-term fasting, the body protects muscle through increased growth hormone secretion and preferential fat utilization. Muscle breakdown occurs primarily under conditions of prolonged malnutrition, not controlled fasting. Beyond the body, fasting exerts profound effects on the brain. Levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor increase, supporting neuronal resilience, plasticity, and cognitive function. This is one reason many people report improved focus during fasting. Blood flow shifts. Ketones provide a stable fuel source. Digestive demand no longer competes with neural resources. Over time, these adaptations compound. The distinction between lifespan and health span becomes critical. Living longer is not the same as living well. The goal is not merely to extend years, but to preserve function, independence, and cognitive clarity deep into later life. Intermittent fasting, when practiced consistently and intelligently, appears to compress the period of decline rather than eliminate it entirely. This is not a claim of immortality. It is a reframing of priorities. Aging is not something that happens suddenly at old age. It is the cumulative result of how often the body is allowed to repair itself. Intermittent fasting restores access to those repair mechanisms, not through deprivation, but through strategic absence. In the next part of this video, we will examine what happens when intermittent fasting is practiced long-term, how these cellular changes translate into measurable markers of biological age, and how to apply fasting in a way that supports longevity without triggering stress or dysfunction. To understand what long-term intermittent fasting actually does to the aging process, we need to move away from surface outcomes and focus on measurable biological signals. Aging is not diagnosed by wrinkles or gray hair. It is measured by cellular efficiency, metabolic stability, inflammatory load, and the integrity of systems that maintain order inside the body. When researchers study populations that practice intermittent fasting over extended periods, the most consistent changes appear not on the scale, but in these internal markers. One of the most important markers is insulin sensitivity. Insulin is not simply a blood sugar hormone. It is a master regulator of energy storage, growth signaling, and cellular aging. Chronically elevated insulin accelerates aging by keeping cells locked in growth mode and suppressing repair pathways. Long-term intermittent fasting reduces baseline insulin levels and restores sensitivity at the cellular level. This means the body requires less insulin to manage the same amount of glucose, reducing metabolic strain and lowering the risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and neurodegeneration. Closely tied to insulin signaling is chronic inflammation. Low-grade, systemic inflammation is one of the strongest predictors of age-related disease. It silently damages blood vessels, disrupts immune balance, and accelerates tissue degeneration. Constant eating keeps the digestive and immune systems in a state of perpetual activation. Over time, this leads to inflammatory spillover that affects the entire body. Intermittent fasting interrupts this cycle. Periods without food allow inflammatory signaling to quiet down. The gut lining has time to repair. Immune cells recalibrate. This reduction in inflammatory burden is one reason fasting is associated with improvements in joint health, cardiovascular markers, and cognitive resilience. Another area of growing research interest is mitochondrial function. Mitochondria are not static power plants. They constantly adapt to energy demands. When fuel availability is constant, inefficient mitochondria are tolerated. When energy becomes scarce, the body is forced to optimize. Fasting creates a selective pressure that favors efficient mitochondria and eliminates dysfunctional ones through autophagy. Over time, this improves energy production while reducing oxidative stress, a key driver of cellular aging. Telomeres, the protective caps at the ends of chromosomes, are often discussed in aging research. While telomere length is influenced by many factors, metabolic stress and inflammation play a significant role in their erosion. Populations practicing caloric restriction and intermittent fasting often show slower telomere shortening, suggesting a preservation of cellular replication capacity. This does not imply immortality, but it does indicate a slower biological clock. One of the most misunderstood aspects of fasting is stress. Critics often argue that fasting is a form of chronic stress that could accelerate aging. This concern arises from a failure to distinguish between harmful stress and adaptive stress. Biology operates on a principle called hormesis. Small, controlled stressors trigger adaptation and resilience. Excessive, uncontrolled stress causes damage. Intermittent fasting, when practiced properly, falls into the first category. It provides a temporary metabolic challenge that strengthens regulatory systems rather than overwhelming them. This distinction is critical when discussing cortisol. Short-term fasting may elevate cortisol slightly, but this response is transient and context-dependent. In contrast, constant overfeeding and insulin resistance create persistent hormonal stress that the body cannot resolve. Over time, the regulated stress of fasting appears to improve stress tolerance rather than degrade it. Long-term intermittent fasting also influences how the body allocates resources as it ages. In a constantly fed state, resources are prioritized towards storage and growth. In a fasted state, resources shift toward maintenance and repair. This shift becomes increasingly important with age, as the body's capacity to correct errors declines. By regularly activating repair pathways, fasting helps preserve functional capacity longer into life. Importantly, none of these benefits occur in isolation. They are cumulative. Small improvements in insulin sensitivity reduce inflammation. Reduced inflammation protects mitochondria. Healthier mitochondria improve energy efficiency and reduce oxidative damage. This interconnected network of effects is what distinguishes fasting as a longevity strategy rather than a simple dietary intervention. However, long-term success depends on context. Fasting does not compensate for poor nutrition. The quality of food consumed during eating windows directly influences outcomes. Diets rich in whole foods, adequate protein, and micronutrients support the adaptive processes activated by fasting. Diets high in ultra-processed foods undermine them. Fasting amplifies what you do right, but it also magnifies what you do wrong. It is also essential to recognize individual variability. Age, activity level, metabolic health, and stress load all influence how fasting is experienced. There is no single schedule that fits everyone. The goal is not maximal restriction, but sustainable rhythm. Consistency matters more than intensity. A moderate fasting window practiced regularly is more effective than extreme protocols followed intermittently. As people age, the question shifts from how to lose weight to how to maintain independence. Muscle mass, bone density, cognitive function, and cardiovascular capacity become priorities. When combined with resistance training and adequate protein intake, intermittent fasting does not impair these systems. In many cases, it supports them by improving hormonal signaling and metabolic efficiency. Ultimately, the value of long-term intermittent fasting lies in its ability to realign modern behavior with ancient biology. Humans evolved in an environment where food availability fluctuated. The body's repair systems evolved in response to that fluctuation. Constant feeding is the anomaly. Fasting restores balance. In the next section, we will move from mechanisms to application. We will explore how to structure intermittent fasting for long-term health, how to avoid common mistakes that negate its benefits, and how to integrate fasting into a lifestyle that supports longevity rather than obsession. Once the biological mechanisms are understood, the next critical question becomes practical. How do you apply intermittent fasting in a way that supports long-term health rather than undermines it? This is where most people fail, not because fasting does not work, but because they treat it as a rule instead of a tool. Longevity is not built through rigid extremes. It is built through sustainable patterns that align with physiology. The first principle to understand is that intermittent fasting is not defined by a specific number of hours. It is defined by the presence of a consistent daily or weekly period where insulin is low, digestion is paused, and repair pathways can activate. For many people, this begins with a simple overnight fast extended slightly beyond what is culturally normal. A 12-hour fast may already provide meaningful benefits for individuals coming from constant grazing. From there, fasting windows can be gradually extended to 14 or 16 hours as metabolic flexibility improves. The mistake many people make is assuming that longer is always better. In reality, the benefits of fasting follow a curve, not a straight line. Beyond a certain point, extending the fasting window further does not proportionally increase benefits and may introduce unnecessary stress, especially when combined with inadequate nutrition or excessive training. The goal is not to maximize deprivation, but to maximize recovery. Protein intake is one of the most misunderstood aspects of intermittent fasting. Concerns about muscle loss often lead people to overconsume protein in compressed eating windows or to avoid fasting altogether. The reality is more nuanced. Muscle preservation depends far more on total daily protein intake and resistance training than on meal timing alone. When fasting is paired with sufficient protein during eating windows and regular strength training, muscle mass is preserved and often improved. Timing protein intake closer to training sessions can further support muscle maintenance. For individuals who train in a fasted state, consuming protein shortly after exercise provides the necessary amino acids for repair without disrupting the metabolic benefits of fasting. For others, training may be more effective during fed states. Both approaches can work. The determining factor is not ideology, but recovery and consistency. Another critical variable is caloric quality. Fasting amplifies metabolic signals, which means it also amplifies the impact of poor food choices. Breaking a fast with highly processed carbohydrates and fats spikes insulin, increases inflammation, and negates many of the benefits gained during the fasting period. In contrast, meals built around whole foods, lean proteins, fibrous vegetables, healthy fats, support stable glucose responses and prolong metabolic benefits. This is why intermittent fasting should never be discussed in isolation from diet composition. Fasting creates the conditions for repair. Nutrition determines whether repair is actually possible. Micronutrients, minerals, and adequate energy intake are required to rebuild tissue, synthesize enzymes, and maintain hormonal balance. Chronic undereating, even within a fasting framework, accelerates decline rather than preventing it. Training alignment is another area where nuance matters. Physical activity is itself a form of hormetic stress. Combined with fasting, it can be highly beneficial, but only if recovery is prioritized. Resistance training sends a signal to preserve muscle and bone density. Cardiovascular exercise improves mitochondrial efficiency. When layered intelligently with fasting, these signals reinforce each other. When layered carelessly, they compete. For most individuals focused on longevity, resistance training 2 to 4 times per week, combined with moderate aerobic activity, is sufficient. Extreme endurance training layered onto aggressive fasting protocols often backfires, elevating stress hormones and impairing recovery. Again, the objective is not maximal output, but long-term function. Sleep quality is often overlooked in discussions of fasting, yet it may be one of the most important moderators of success. Sleep is when many repair processes peak. Fasting that disrupts sleep, whether through excessive hunger, poor meal timing, or elevated stress, undermines its own purpose. Adjusting the timing of the final meal earlier in the evening often improves sleep quality by reducing nocturnal insulin spikes and digestive activity. Individual context cannot be ignored. Age, sex, metabolic health, and life stress all influence how fasting is experienced. Younger individuals with high activity levels may tolerate longer fasting windows. Older individuals or those with metabolic dysfunction may benefit more from shorter, consistent fasts, paired with high-quality nutrition. There is no universal prescription. It is also important to address psychological relationship with fasting. When fasting becomes a test of discipline or self-worth, it stops serving health. Sustainable fasting feels structured but flexible. It supports clarity rather than obsession. The ability to break a fast when necessary without guilt is a sign of metabolic control, not failure. Over the long term, the most powerful benefit of intermittent fasting may not be any single biomarker. It may be the restoration of metabolic awareness. Hunger becomes a signal rather than an emergency. Satiety becomes clearer. Energy stabilizes. The body becomes predictable again. This predictability is what allows aging to unfold more slowly and gracefully. When the body is no longer overwhelmed by constant input, it can allocate resources intelligently. Repair becomes routine rather than rare. Damage accumulates more slowly. Function is preserved longer. In the final part of this video, we will integrate everything discussed so far into a long-term perspective. We will examine what successful aging actually looks like in practical terms and how intermittent fasting fits into a broader framework of health span optimization rather than short-term performance. At this point, the conversation about intermittent fasting needs to mature. It must move beyond protocols, schedules, and surface-level outcomes and shift toward a deeper question. What does successful aging actually look like, and how does fasting fit into that picture? Because longevity is not measured by how long the body avoids death. It is measured by how long the body maintains function, autonomy, and clarity. This distinction is captured by two terms that are often confused: lifespan and health span. Lifespan refers to the total number of years lived. Health span refers to the number of years lived in good health. Modern medicine has been remarkably successful at extending lifespan. It has been far less successful at extending health span. As a result, many people spend the final decade or more of life managing chronic disease, functional decline, and cognitive impairment. This is not an inevitable outcome of aging. It is the result of biological systems that have been chronically overloaded and under-repaired. Intermittent fasting does not promise to eliminate aging. What it offers is something more realistic and more valuable, a way to slow the accumulation of biological damage and preserve function for longer. By periodically reducing nutrient signaling, fasting restores access to repair mechanisms that are otherwise suppressed in a constantly fed state. This shift does not require extreme deprivation. It requires consistency and respect for biological limits. One of the most important mindset changes is letting go of the idea that health interventions must feel intense to be effective. Many people equate difficulty with efficacy. In reality, the most powerful longevity strategies are often subtle. They operate quietly in the background, shaping metabolic patterns over years rather than forcing dramatic changes over weeks. Intermittent fasting works best when it becomes boring, predictable, and integrated into daily life. This is why long-term adherence matters more than short-term optimization. A fasting approach that can be maintained for decades will outperform a more aggressive strategy that leads to burnout or metabolic instability. Health span is not built through heroic efforts. It is built through repetition. Another critical consideration is medical context. Intermittent fasting is not appropriate for everyone in every circumstance. Individuals with a history of eating disorders, advanced metabolic disease, or specific medical conditions should approach fasting cautiously and under professional guidance. Pregnancy, childhood, and periods of acute illness are not appropriate times for caloric restriction. These caveats do not weaken the value of fasting. They clarify its role as a targeted tool rather than a universal solution. It is also essential to emphasize that fasting does not replace other pillars of health. Physical activity, sleep, nutrition quality, and stress management remain foundational. Fasting interacts with these variables. It does not override them. When these pillars are neglected, fasting loses much of its benefit and may even become counterproductive. When they are aligned, fasting amplifies their effects. From a scientific perspective, one of the most compelling aspects of intermittent fasting is its evolutionary coherence. Human physiology evolved in an environment characterized by variability. Periods of abundance alternated with periods of scarcity. Repair systems evolved in response to this rhythm. Modern constant feeding disrupts it. Fasting restores it. This does not mean modern life should mimic the past exactly. It means modern strategies should respect the constraints under which the body evolved. Over time, individuals who practice intermittent fasting consistently often report a subtle but meaningful shift in their relationship with their bodies. Hunger becomes informational rather than threatening. Energy becomes more stable. Cravings diminish. Decision-making around food becomes less emotionally charged. These changes are not psychological tricks. They are reflections of a metabolism that is no longer constantly dysregulated. This metabolic stability has downstream effects on aging. Stable glucose reduces glycation damage. Lower inflammation protects tissues. Efficient mitochondria support energy demands with less oxidative stress. Together, these factors slow the rate at which systems degrade. Aging continues, but it unfolds with less friction. The goal, ultimately, is not to chase youth. It is to preserve capability, to remain physically capable, cognitively sharp, and metabolically resilient for as long as possible. Intermittent fasting is not a guarantee of this outcome, but it is one of the few interventions that consistently aligns with this goal across multiple biological systems. As research continues, the details will evolve. Optimal fasting windows may vary, individual responses will differ, but the core principle is unlikely to change. Periodic absence of food is not harmful to human biology. It is essential to it. In a world defined by constant consumption, the ability to pause is a form of intelligence. Intermittent fasting is not about doing less for the sake of deprivation. It is about creating space for repair, for recalibration, for longevity. If this video has shifted how you think about aging, health, or fasting, consider how these principles might fit into your own life, not as rules to follow rigidly, but as tools to be applied thoughtfully. Because the goal is not perfection. The goal is sustainability. Aging is inevitable. Decline is not. And the difference lies not in how much we consume, but in how often we allow the body to rest, repair, and recover.